The old John Deere tractor's engine sputtered and then roared to life, sending vibrations through the weathered floorboards of the century-old barn. Jackson Miller guided the vintage machine toward the far corner where he needed to move some heavy equipment. The spring rains had finally arrived after 3 years of devastating drought, and he needed to prepare for planting season, perhaps his last on this land. As he crossed the center of the barn, a sickening crack split the air. The right front wheel punched through the ancient wooden floor, followed by the rest of the tractor, tilting dangerously. Jackson barely managed to jump clear before the beloved family heirloom crashed partially through the floor, exposing something no miller had seen in generations: a hand-laid brick tunnel stretching into darkness beneath Oakridge Farm. Its entrance, lined with wooden crates stamped with Civil War-era army markings, and something glinting gold in the beam of light now penetrating this long-forgotten underground chamber. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Miller had spent nearly 25 years working the same fertile Nebraska soil that his grandfather had purchased in the aftermath of the Great Depression. His modest 180-acre farm, nestled between the gently rolling hills and Cottonwood Creek, was known throughout Riverdale County for its quality corn and the distinctive red barn that had stood on the property since 1891. Oakridge Farm, as locals called it, had once been a thriving operation, producing bumper crops that sustained the Miller family through good times and bad, providing grain to markets throughout the Midwest, and hosting the county's most anticipated harvest festival each autumn. But times had changed dramatically for Jackson and his once prosperous family business. For 3 generations, the Millers had been respected fixtures in the Riverdale community. Jackson's grandfather, Harold Miller, had purchased the land in 1937 after losing everything in the Dust Bowl, slowly rebuilding with a vision of creating sustainable farmland that could weather any storm. Through sheer determination and innovative dry farming techniques, he transformed the depleted soil into productive acreage, establishing a legacy that he hoped would sustain his family for generations to come. Jackson's father, William, had expanded the farm during the agricultural boom of the 1970s, introducing new crop varieties and modernizing their equipment. Under his stewardship, Oakridge Farm became known for quality harvests and forward-thinking practices. The annual Harvest Festival had been a highlight of the county calendar, drawing visitors from across the state to enjoy hay rides, corn mazes, and home-cooked meals that showcased the farm's bounty. But the past decade had brought one challenge after another to Jackson's doorstep. Large agricultural corporations had moved into the region, their industrial operations and exclusive contracts making it nearly impossible for family farms like Oakridge to compete. Climate change had brought increasingly unpredictable weather, severe drought years followed by flooding, unseasonable frosts, and devastating windstorms, affecting growing seasons in ways that made each year more uncertain than the last. The rising costs of seed, fertilizer, equipment maintenance, and fuel had squeezed his already thin profit margins to the breaking point. Jackson had been forced to let go of the seasonal workers who had once helped with planting and harvest, many from families that had worked alongside the Millers for generations. The once popular Harvest Festival had been discontinued 3 years ago when Jackson could no longer afford the insurance and organizational costs. But perhaps most troubling of all was the state of the old red barn. The distinctive structure with its weathered timber frame and hand-laid stone foundation had become something of a local landmark, but was showing its age in concerning ways. The roof sagged ominously in several places. The ancient oak beams groaned under the weight of decades, and the foundation had begun to crack and shift with the constant cycle of drought and moisture. Local contractors had quoted repairs in the tens of thousands of dollars, money that Jackson simply didn't have. Every morning as Jackson walked past the weathered structure on his way to tend his fields, he felt the weight of his family's legacy bearing down on him. Would he be the miller who finally failed, the one who lost the land his grandfather had worked so hard to establish? The thought kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the farmhouse built in 1885, calculating and recalculating figures that never added up to salvation. The barn itself held a special place in Jackson's heart. As a boy, he had spent countless hours there with his father and grandfather, learning to repair equipment, store grain properly, and sort livestock, listening to stories of harvests past, absorbing the practical wisdom that had been passed down through generations of farmers. The building wasn't just a structure, it was a repository of family history, every worn beam and weathered board telling a story of the Miller family's relationship with the land. Local historians had occasionally remarked that the barn was unusually well built for an agricultural outbuilding of its era, with construction techniques that seemed somewhat sophisticated for rural Nebraska. Some speculated that it might have been constructed by specialized craftsmen, perhaps traveling builders who had worked on more significant projects back east. The barn's position, partially built into a small rise with a curious arrangement of interior walls, had always struck visitors as unusual, but these academic curiosities did little to address the very real problem of the building's deterioration. Jackson had tried everything to keep the farm viable. He diversified into organic crops for premium pricing, attempted to establish community-supported agriculture subscriptions, and even leased part of his land to a neighboring farmer. But each new venture required capital he didn't have, and the banks had grown increasingly reluctant to extend credit to small farmers like him, especially with the property's decreasing value and his mounting debts. His daughter, Emma, studying agricultural science at the University of Nebraska, still dreamed of returning home after graduation to help modernize the farm and carry on the family tradition. She had ambitious plans involving sustainable farming, practices, and direct-to-consumer marketing that could command premium prices. But Jackson couldn't bear the thought of passing on a failing business to his only child, burdening her with debt and dwindling prospects instead of opportunity. The proud farming tradition that had defined the Millers for 3 generations seemed to be slipping away like topsoil in a dust storm. The red barn stood as a daily reminder of both the farm's proud history and its uncertain future, its shadow falling across the farmyard each evening as Jackson completed his daily chores alone, where once 3 generations had worked, side by side. Developers had begun to circle like hawks over a freshly plowed field, presenting offers to buy the land for a suburban housing development. The thought of seeing the fields his family had worked for decades carved up into cookie-cutter lots was almost unbearable. But with each passing season, his options seemed to grow more limited and the weight of his responsibilities more crushing. Little did Jackson know that fate was about to intervene in a way he could never have imagined. The old red barn that had been causing him so much worry was about to reveal a secret that would change everything, not just for Oakridge Farm, but for our understanding of Civil War history itself. The morning of April 12th began like any other spring day on Oakridge Farm. Jackson rose before dawn, his joints protesting with familiar aches as he pulled on his worn work boots and heavy canvas jacket against the morning chill. The kitchen was quiet, the house too large now for just one person since his wife Karen had left 3 years ago. Unable to face the constant stress of their financial uncertainty, he made his coffee black and strong, just as his grandfather had taught him, and stood by the window watching the first pale light creep across his fields. From his kitchen window, Jackson could see the old red barn silhouetted against the brightening sky, its weathered profile a permanent fixture in his life's landscape. The Oakridge Farm had been in continuous operation since 1937, when his grandfather Harold purchased the land after losing his previous farm to drought and bank foreclosures during the Dust Bowl years. "Land abides," Harold had often told a young Jackson, his calloused hands resting on the boy's shoulders as they surveyed their property from the rise behind the house. "Money comes and goes, markets rise and fall, but good land, well tended, will feed your family when everything else fails." Those words had guided Jackson through decades of farming, through market crashes and agricultural policy shifts, through personal loss and natural disasters. Now at 53, with grey dominating his once sandy hair and deep lines carved into his weathered face, Jackson wondered if his grandfather's wisdom had finally met its match in the relentless pressures of modern industrial agriculture and climate change. As he drained the last of his coffee, Jackson's phone chimed with a weather alert. A significant storm system was moving in, expected to bring heavy rainfall to Nebraska over the next 48 hours. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After 3 years of drought that had depleted his soil and his savings, the rain would be welcome, but the forecast warned of potential flash flooding in areas where the parched ground couldn't absorb the sudden deluge. Jackson sighed, setting down his empty mug. The weather forecast was the final piece of bad news in what had already been a difficult month. The bank had denied his operating loan application, and the property tax bill that had arrived yesterday confirmed what he'd already suspected. He wouldn't be able to make ends meet through the harvest without selling off more of his equipment or land. Outside, the wind was already picking up, bending the young corn shoots that had just begun to emerge in his east field. Jackson pulled his jacket tighter around himself and headed toward the barn to secure what he could before the storm hit in earnest. The tractor, his grandfather's 1952 John Deere Model B that had been lovingly maintained through the decades, needed to be moved inside, and there was equipment to be secured. The other farm buildings had been maintained as best Jackson could, manage over the years, patched roofs, reinforced walls, new doors. But the main barn had always seemed like too massive an undertaking with its structural issues. Now, eyeing the darkening clouds on the horizon, Jackson worried that this might be the storm that finally brought the old structure down. Inside the main barn, Jackson methodically checked that the equipment was properly stored and covered. The newer tractor, now over 15 years old but meticulously maintained, sat ready beside the smaller utility vehicle he'd purchased used when the farm still turned a modest profit. Hanging on the wall were the tools his grandfather and father had used, their handles worn smooth by 3 generations of miller hands. Next to his father's old toolbox hung a framed photograph that Jackson paused to look at whenever he entered the main storage area. It showed 3 generations of miller men standing proudly in front of the red barn on the day Jackson had officially taken over the farm management from his father. His grandfather, though elderly and stooped in the photo, still radiated the fierce pride and determination that had rebuilt the farm from nothing. His father stood tall and confident, one hand on Jackson's shoulder, and Jackson himself, 20 years younger, beaming with optimism about the future stretching before him. That future had unfolded very differently than the young man in the photograph had imagined. After securing the newer equipment, Jackson turned his attention to his grandfather's old John Deere tractor. Though it was no longer used for heavy field work, Jackson kept it operational out of respect for his grandfather's memory. It had become something of a family heirloom, and Jackson still used it occasionally for light tasks around the farmyard. Today, he needed to move it to make room for some equipment that needed to be protected from the coming storm. The tractor's engine protested briefly before catching, the familiar rumble filling the barn as Jackson eased it into gear. He carefully maneuvered between stacked hay bales and stored equipment, heading toward the back of the barn where he planned to park it until the storm passed. As he crossed the center section of the barn floor, Jackson felt a slight give beneath the right wheels. He should have known then to stop, but the need to secure everything before the storm pushed him forward. Suddenly, there was a sickening crack, the sound of century-old timber giving way. The floor beneath the tractor's right front wheel collapsed, and Jackson had just enough time to throw himself sideways off the seat before the machine tilted dangerously, its front end disappearing into a dark hole that had opened in the barn floor. For several terrifying moments, Jackson remained frozen in place, heart pounding in his ears as dust and splinters settled around him. When nothing more collapsed, he cautiously approached the edge of the hole. The tractor had fallen only partially. Through, its back wheels still on solid flooring, while the front end disappeared into darkness below. As the dust cleared, Jackson realized he was looking not at bare earth or a simple crawl space, but at something far more deliberate, a brick-lined tunnel stretching away into darkness. Grabbing his flashlight from his pocket, Jackson directed the beam into the opening. The tunnel appeared to be carefully constructed, with an arched brick ceiling and what looked like wooden supports at regular intervals. But what truly caught his attention were the objects now visible in the beam of light, wooden crates stacked along one wall of the tunnel, their sides stamped with faded markings that appeared to be military in origin. Curiosity overcame caution as Jackson found a more stable section of flooring and carefully lowered himself into the opening. The drop was about 8 feet, and he landed beside the front of his grandfather's tractor, which had punched through the thin wooden ceiling of the tunnel. Up close, he could now see that the bricks lining the tunnel were handmade, their irregular shapes and varying colors suggesting they had been locally produced rather than factory manufactured. The tunnel extended in both directions, toward the back of the barn in one direction and toward the farmhouse in the other. The wooden crates that had caught his attention were stacked neatly along the wall, their markings now clearly visible as U.S. Army, followed by dates from 1863. With trembling hands, Jackson approached the nearest crate. Its lid had been partially dislodged by the tractor's fall, and something inside caught the beam of his flashlight, reflecting it back with a distinctly golden gleam. Using a pocket knife, Jackson carefully pried the lid further open. Inside, nestled in straw packing that had long since turned to dust, were rows of gold coins, Union Army gold eagles, $10 gold pieces that had been minted during the Civil War. A quick mental calculation suggested the crate might contain thousands of dollars in face value alone, and as historical gold coins, their actual value would be many times that. But the crates weren't the only items stored in the tunnel. As Jackson directed his light further along the passage, he spotted a leather-bound book sitting on a small wooden table, its cover aged but intact. When he gently opened it, he found himself looking at a journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The first entry was dated April 1863, and as Jackson skimmed the contents, he realized he was reading an account of Underground Railroad activities. Detailed records of enslaved people helped to freedom through a network that apparently included this very tunnel beneath his family's farm. The journal entries continued through 1865, documenting not only escape routes and numbers of people assisted, but also references to supply shipments and army funds being moved through the network. As the Civil War progressed, what Jackson had stumbled upon wasn't just a historical curiosity, it was evidence of a previously undocumented underground railroad station that had doubled as a secret supply line for Union forces during the final years of the Civil War. Monday, he examined more of the tunnel. Jackson discovered iron rings bolted to the walls at regular intervals, likely used to secure lanterns, and rudimentary ventilation shafts that extended upward, cleverly disguised as fence posts in the farmyard. above. The craftsmanship and planning that had gone into the tunnel's construction spoke of significant resources and organization. This was no hasty excavation, but a carefully engineered structure built for long-term use. The sound of his phone ringing startled Jackson out of his historical reverie. The display showed Emma's name, his daughter checking in, as she often did on days when bad weather was expected. As he climbed carefully out of the tunnel to answer the call, Jackson's mind raced with the implications of his discovery. The historical significance alone was staggering. A previously unknown underground railroad station with documentation intact. And then there was the gold, what appeared to be Union Army funds, perhaps intended for military operations in the West, somehow never delivered and forgotten beneath his land for more than 150 years. "Dad, are you okay?" The Weather Channel. "Who says the storm's intensifying?" Emma's concerned voice brought Jackson back to the present. "I'm fine, honey," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "But something's happened at the farm, something big. I need you to come home this weekend if you can." "Dad, what's wrong? Is it the barn? Did it finally collapse?" The worry in her voice reflected years of shared concern over the farm's precarious state. "Not exactly," Jackson said, looking back at the hole in the floor with the front end of his grandfather's tractor still visible in its depths. "The barn's still standing, but I found something underneath it, something that might change everything." As Jackson ended the call with a promise to fill Emma in on the details when she arrived, the first heavy raindrops began to strike the barn roof overhead. The storm that he had feared might destroy what remained of his family's legacy had instead led to a discovery that could save it and rewrite a chapter of American history in the process. Rain now pounded against the barn in earnest, and Jackson realized he needed to secure the site before proceeding further. The hole in the floor could be dangerous, and the tractor's position was precarious. More importantly, the historical artifacts and documents needed protection from potential water damage if the storm caused further leaks in the aged roof. He carefully gathered the journal and a small sampling of the coins, securing them in waterproof tool cases before covering the opening, with a heavy tarp weighted down with concrete blocks. The immediate safety measures complete, Jackson retreated to the farmhouse, the journal and sample coins in hand, determined to examine his discovery more thoroughly before deciding on next steps. Sitting at the kitchen table where 3 generations of millers had shared meals and made farming decisions, Jackson spread out his findings. The journal, upon closer reading, revealed an astonishing story. It had been written by a man named Samuel Thornton, who identified himself as a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a liaison with Union Army intelligence operations in the Nebraska Territory. The farm, not yet Oakridge but referred to as Thornton Station, had served as both a waypoint for freedom seekers traveling north to Canada and a secure transfer point for Union funds and intelligence moving west. The most startling entries describe the arrival of gold shipments intended to finance Union operations against Confederate sympathizers in the Western Territories. The final such shipment, delivered in early 1865, had never been forwarded to its destination due to news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox. According to the journal's last entry, dated April 20th, 1865, Thornton had received orders to secure the remaining gold in place until further instructions arrived, instructions that apparently never came in the chaos following Lincoln's assassination and the war's end. As night fell and the storm raged outside, Jackson found himself facing a complex moral and practical dilemma. The historical significance of his discovery was undeniable. This was a previously unknown chapter in the history of both the Underground Railroad and Civil War Western operations. But there was also the matter of the gold, seemingly abandoned government property, but of considerable value both historically and monetarily. Did it legally belong to the government still? To Jackson as the property owner? Or should it be preserved intact in a museum. And looming over all these questions was the immediate concern of his farm's survival. The bank was foreclosing in 60 days unless he could make a substantial payment. The developer's offers to buy the land for a fraction of its historical value sat on his desk, seeming more inevitable with each passing day. Could this discovery change that trajectory? Should it? With these questions swirling in his mind, Jackson finally fell into an exhausted sleep at the kitchen table, the journal open beside him, and the storm still battering the windows of the farmhouse that had sheltered his family for generations. A house that, unbeknownst to him until today, had been built by a man who had risked everything to help others find freedom while serving his country in shadow operations, far from the main battlefields of the Civil War. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed in, the night leaving puddles in the farmyard and a sense of renewal in the air. Jackson's first concern was checking the barn and the tunnel to ensure nothing had been damaged by the heavy rainfall. To his relief, his temporary measures had held, though water had seeped in around the edges of the tarp. The tractor remained, where it had fallen, its front end still resting in the tunnel below. As he pondered how to proceed, the sound of tires on gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Thomas Fletcher, whose family had farmed neighboring land for nearly as long as the Millers, pulled up in his mud-spattered pickup truck. At 72, Tom was something of a local historian, his farmhouse walls covered with maps and photographs documenting the area's development since territorial days. "Saw your barn took some damage," Tom called as he climbed stiffly from his truck. "Thought I'd check if you needed an extra pair of hands." Jackson hesitated only briefly before making a decision. If anyone could help him understand the historical context of his discovery, it would be Tom. And after decades of neighborly trust, he knew he could count on Tom's discretion while he figured out how to proceed. "Tom," he said carefully, "I found something yesterday that I think you should see, but I need your word this stays between us for now." Tom's weathered face registered curiosity and concern. "You know you've got it, Jackson. Miller and Fletcher. Farms have kept each other's confidences since before either of us was born." Inside the barn, Tom stared in amazement at the hole in the floor and what it revealed. "Good Lord above," he whispered as Jackson shone his flashlight into the tunnel below. "I've heard stories all my life about underground railroad activity in this county, but there's never been physical proof before." Together, they found a safer way to access the tunnel through a trapdoor Jackson discovered under a stack of hay bales. An entrance apparently designed for the purpose, but long since forgotten and concealed. The tunnel revealed itself to be even more extensive than Jackson had initially realized, with branches leading in several directions and what appeared to be small chambers set at intervals. "This wasn't just a passage point," Tom observed as they carefully explored the brick-lined tunnel. "This was a full station, large enough to conceal and supply multiple people at once." He examined the construction with expert eyes. "These bricks were likely made right here on the property. See the clay composition. Matches the soil in your east field." When Jackson showed him the journal and the crates of gold coins, Tom's hands trembled slightly. "Do you realize what you've found, Jackson? This isn't just local history. This is national history. This could rewrite what we know about both the Underground Railroad's western reach and Union operations in the territories." As they carefully documented their findings with photographs and notes, Tom shared what he knew of Samuel Thornton from local historical records. There was a Thornton who owned this land from the 1850s until about 1880. Records show he sold to a family named Carson, who then lost it during the 1890s Depression. "It changed hands a few times before your grandfather bought it in 37. Tom paused, studying the journal entries more closely. "What's fascinating is that Thornton was known locally as a somewhat reclusive farmer. No one suspected he was running underground railroad operations, much less working with Union intelligence. If this journal is accurate, he was leading a complete double life. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching, this one moving faster and with purpose. Jackson and Tom emerged from the barn to find a black SUV with government plates pulling up beside Tom's truck. A tall woman in a dark suit stepped out, her manner professional but urgent. "Mr. Miller, I'm Agent Diana Cooper with the Treasury Department's Historical Crimes Division," she said, producing official identification. "We've received information about a significant historical discovery on your property involving Civil War-era federal assets." Jackson shot Tom a questioning look, but the older man shook his head slightly. He hadn't contacted anyone. Agent Cooper noticed the exchange. "Neither of you is in any trouble," she assured them. "Our department monitors certain historical keywords in digital communications for potential discoveries of lost government property. Your call with your daughter yesterday triggered some alerts." She glanced toward the barn. "I understand you've discovered a tunnel system with Union Army gold. I'm here to assess the finding and discuss proper procedures for historical preservation and recovery." Jackson felt a surge of protectiveness. This was his land, his discovery, something that might save his family's farm after generations of struggle. "With all due respect, Agent Cooper, this is private property. The tunnel has been here for over 150 years, and no one from the government has shown any interest until now." Agent Cooper's expression softened slightly. "I understand your concern, Mr. Miller, but there are complex legal and historical considerations here. The gold was federal property, never decommissioned or officially abandoned." "However," she added, seeing Jackson's expression harden, "there are provisions for landowners who discover and report such findings properly." Before Jackson could respond, another vehicle approached. This one he recognized as Dr. Martin Reynolds from the State Historical Society, someone Jackson had met occasionally at county historical events. What he couldn't understand was how the historian had known to come today, of all days. As if reading his thoughts, Agent Cooper explained, "I contacted Dr. Reynolds on my way here. Discoveries of this magnitude require both government and historical expertise to handle properly. Dr. Reynolds, a bearded man in his 60s, with the enthusiastic energy of someone half his age, practically bounded from his car. "Mr. Miller, is it true? An intact underground railroad station with documentation and artifacts? This could be the most significant historical discovery in the state in decades." The conversation that followed on Jackson's front porch stretched into hours, with Agent Cooper explaining the legal framework for handling discovered government property, while Dr. Reynolds outlined the historical significance and preservation options. Tom Fletcher offered valuable context from local records and oral histories he'd collected over the years. "Here's what I can tell you officially," Agent Cooper finally said, as the afternoon sun began to lower. "The gold technically remains government and property, but there are reward provisions for discovery and reporting. Those provisions amount to 40% of the assessed value, which, given both the gold content and the historical significance of these specific coins, would be substantial." Dr. Reynolds jumped in eagerly. "And the historical significance can't be overstated. This site would qualify for immediate inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, with all the preservation funding and tax advantages that entails. The documentation alone, a first-hand account of underground railroad operations in Nebraska territory, is priceless to historians." Jackson sat quietly, processing these possibilities. After a moment, he asked the question that had been foremost. In his mind, since the discovery, what would this mean for my farm? For my family's legacy here? "With proper management," Agent Cooper said carefully, "the financial aspects alone could secure the farm's future. The reward value of the gold, combined with historical preservation grants, would likely resolve any immediate financial concerns. But beyond that, Dr. Reynolds added, his eyes bright with possibilities, Oakridge Farm could become an educational center, a place where people come to learn about this hidden chapter of American history. The farm wouldn't just survive, Mr. Miller. It would take on new significance while honoring its past. As the sun set over Oakridge Farm, Jackson Miller found himself at a crossroads as significant as the one his grandfather had faced in 1937 when he purchased this land with the last of his savings. The path forward would require careful navigation of legal, historical, and personal considerations, but for the first time in years, that path didn't seem to be leading inevitably toward loss and failure. The old red barn, which had stood for over a century keeping its secrets, had finally revealed not just hidden history, but perhaps a new future for the Miller family legacy, one where preservation and progress could coexist, where the past could help secure what was to come. And as Jackson watched the last light of day glint off the weathered red boards of the barn, he thought of his grandfather's words, "Land abides." Perhaps Harold Miller had known more than he ever revealed about the ground he had chosen to rebuild his life upon. Land that had once been a beacon of freedom and courage in dark times, now offering a new kind of salvation to his grandson when it was needed most. As morning broke the following day, the farmhouse came alive with activity it hadn't seen in years. Emma had arrived late the previous night, driving straight from Lincoln after her last class. Her car loaded with research materials on Nebraska's Underground Railroad history. Dr. Reynolds had returned with 2 colleagues from the State Historical Society, equipped with specialized cameras and documentation tools. Agent Cooper had brought in a small team of experts in historical asset preservation from the Treasury Department. The barn had been cordoned off, yellow caution tape creating a boundary that transformed the familiar agricultural structure into something resembling an archaeological site. Jackson watched from the porch, coffee mug in hand, as the experts moved purposefully between the barn and their vehicles, establishing what Dr. Reynolds had enthusiastically termed a field headquarters for historical recovery. Emma joined her father on the porch, her own coffee steaming in the cool morning air. At 22, she had her mother's analytical mind and her grandfather's stubborn determination. Her agricultural studies had recently expanded to include historical land use patterns, making her uniquely positioned to appreciate the significance of what lay beneath the barn floor. "You know," she said, nudging Jackson's shoulder gently, "when you called yesterday, I thought this was going to be bad news, like the bank had moved up the foreclosure date or something. This is definitely not what I was expecting." Jackson managed a smile. "That makes 2 of us. I was just trying to move the tractor to make room for the combine before the storm hit." "Dad, do you realize what this means? This isn't just about the money, though God knows we need that. This discovery, it changes everything we thought we knew about Nebraska's role in the Civil War and the Underground Railroad. The textbooks say the Underground Railroad barely reached this far west, but this proves there was an organized, well-established network here." Jackson nodded slowly. "Your grandfather always said this land had character. Guess it had more character than any of us realized." They watched as Dr. Reynolds emerged from the barn, talking animatedly with a younger colleague. The historian spotted them on the porch and made his way over, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Miller, Jackson, we've found more chambers extending from the main tunnel. One appears to have been a living space, with bunk frames still intact. Another seems to have been a supply room, and we've discovered something else, hidden caches of weapons, Union Army rifles and ammunition preserved in Cosmoline. This wasn't just a way station for escaped slaves and gold shipments. It was a fully equipped Union outpost operating behind what many considered to be Confederate sympathetic territory." Emma's eyes widened. But Nebraska was a Union territory during the Civil War. Dr. Reynolds nodded eagerly. Officially, yes, but the reality was much more complex. This area had significant Southern sympathy, particularly among settlers who had moved here from border states. What we're finding suggests that Union Army intelligence was concerned enough about Confederate guerrilla operations to establish secure outposts like this one, hidden in plain sight on working farms. Before Jackson could respond, Agent Cooper approached from the barn, her professional demeanor slightly softened by the excitement of discovery. "We've completed an initial assessment of the gold caches," she said. "Based on the markings and manifest documents we found with them, these were funds designated for military operations in the Dakota and Wyoming territories, specifically to counter Confederate attempts to disrupt the western mail routes and gold shipments from Montana." She consulted her tablet. The preliminary value assessment, based just on the gold content at current market rates, exceeds $3 million. When you factor in the historical significance and numismatic value, the total could be substantially higher. Jackson felt his knees weaken slightly, and he reached for the porch railing to steady himself. $3 million. The farm's entire debt, including the looming mortgage foreclosure, amounted to less than a tenth of that sum. "And my share?" he asked, his voice unnaturally steady. Under the Historical Discoveries Act, as the property owner who properly reported the find, you're entitled to 40% of assessed value, Agent Cooper confirmed. That's before any tax considerations, though there are significant exemptions for historical preservation involvement. Dr. Reynolds couldn't contain himself. "And that's just the beginning, Jackson. The historical grants available for preserving and developing a site of this significance could be substantial. The educational potential alone, this could become one of the most important Civil War and Underground Railroad sites west of the Mississippi." Jackson glanced at Emma, who was staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future for Oakridge Farm that didn't involve bankruptcy or selling off pieces of his grandfather's legacy. "What happens now?" he asked, looking between the government agent and the historian. "We'll need a few weeks to properly document everything," Dr. Reynolds said. "Every artifact needs to be catalogued in situ before being moved. The tunnels themselves need to be structurally assessed and preserved." Agent Cooper nodded. "Meanwhile, my department will begin the formal process of valuation and establishing your claim as the reporting property owner. There's paperwork involved, but we can handle most of it. Nothing that should delay your portion of the proceeds beyond the standard processing time." As they continued discussing logistics, Tom Fletcher's truck pulled into the driveway, followed by another vehicle Jackson didn't recognize. Tom emerged with an elderly man Jackson had seen occasionally at community events, but didn't know well. Walter Davidson, at 94, the oldest resident of Riverdale County and a well-known keeper of local history. Tom helped the elderly man navigate the uneven ground toward the porch. "Jackson," Tom called, "Walter here has something you need to hear about your land." Walter Davidson moved slowly, but with surprising steadiness for his age. His eyes, clear and sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows, fixed on Jackson with intense focus. "My grandfather knew Samuel Thornton," he said without preamble, his voice stronger than his fragile appearance suggested. "Worked with him on what they called the freedom business. Never wrote anything down, but the stories were passed along, just in case the knowledge might be needed someday." Jackson guided the elderly man to a chair on the porch, and the others gathered around as Walter continued. Thornton's operation wasn't just about moving people north. He was part of something bigger, a network they called the Liberty Line. It wasn't just for escaping slaves, it was a full-fledged intelligence operation disguised as an underground railroad station. The gold you found, that was payment for. Operations across the Western Territories, operations that never made it into the history books. Dr. Reynolds leaned forward eagerly. "Mr. Davidson, are you saying there was an organized Union intelligence network operating here during the Civil War, using the Underground Railroad as cover?" Walter nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. My grandfather called them Lincolns, ghosts, Union operatives who officially didn't exist, moving through territories where Union sympathy couldn't be openly expressed. They saved hundreds of lives. Escaped slaves, yes, but also Union sympathizers in danger from Confederate guerrillas, operating in the territories." He fixed his gaze on Jackson. "Your land was the heart of it all, the main station for eastern Nebraska. Thornton chose it specifically for the natural rise where the barn sits. It allowed for hidden ventilation shafts and multiple escape routes. When he sold the land in 1880, my grandfather said he made the new owners promise to never disturb the barn floor, told them it was built on a sacred burial ground to scare them off from digging." Emma, who had been listening intently, suddenly straightened. "Wait, if this was so important, why wasn't it in any historical records? Why didn't your grandfather's stories ever become part of local history?" Walter's weathered face creased in a sad smile. "Because after the war, nobody wanted to admit how close we came to having the conflict spread west. The official story became that Nebraska was firmly Union territory. End of discussion. And then there were the gold shipments. Acknowledging. Those would raise too many questions about military funds that were never officially accounted for." Dr. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "That tracks with what we know about post-Civil War historical narratives. There was a deliberate effort to downplay regional divisions in the Western Territories to facilitate national reunification. It's also consistent with the government's handling of covert operations funding, often deliberately obscured, even in internal records." As the historical implications of Walter's story sank in, Agent Cooper received a call on her secure line and stepped away to take it. When she returned, her expression had changed subtly, a new formality entering her posture. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I've just been informed that due to the exceptional historical significance of this discovery, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Director of the National Historical Preservation Trust will be arriving tomorrow to make a formal announcement regarding Oakridge Farm. They're proposing an unprecedented joint federal-state initiative to preserve and develop this site. As a national historical landmark." Jackson blinked, trying to process this information. "The Secretary of the Treasury is coming here, to my farm." "Yes, sir. This discovery isn't just significant locally. It's being regarded as one of the most important Civil War-related finds in the past 50 years. The preservation of intact Underground Railroad stations is exceptionally rare, and one with this level of documentation and associated artifacts is unprecedented." Tom Fletcher let out a low whistle. "From foreclosure to national landmark in 48 hours. That's got to be some kind of record, Jackson." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Jackson felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief about the farm's financial future, pride in the historical significance of his land, and a deepening connection to the generations that had worked this soil before him. His grandfather hadn't just purchased farmland in 1937. He had become part of a chain of stewardship that stretched back to Samuel Thornton and the dangerous, vital work done in secret beneath the barn floor. That evening, after the experts had departed with promises to return at dawn, Jackson and Emma sat on the porch, watching darkness fall over fields that now seemed filled with new meaning. The old red barn, silhouetted against the twilight sky, no longer appeared to be a decaying burden, but instead stood as a proud sentinel, guarding its long-kept secrets. "You know," Emma said quietly, "I've been thinking about changing my thesis. Focus. Instead of modern sustainable farming practices, I could research how historical land use patterns on underground railroad sites like ours influenced agricultural development in the post-Civil War era. Jackson smiled. Sounds like you might be planning to stick around the old place after graduation after all. Wild horses couldn't drag me away now, she replied, her voice firm with newfound purpose. This farm isn't just our family legacy anymore, Dad. It's part of American history, and someone needs to make sure that story gets told right. As stars began to appear in the darkening Nebraska sky, Jackson thought about his grandfather's journey, the desperate purchase of foreclosed land during the Depression, the decades of hard work to build something that would last. Had Harold Miller somehow known about the history beneath the barn floor when he bought the property? Had some whisper of the farm's significance influenced his choice, or was it simply fate that had brought the Millers to this particular piece of land? Whatever the answer, Jackson now understood that his role had evolved. He wasn't just a farmer struggling to preserve a family business. He was the caretaker of a place where history had been made, where courage had operated in darkness to bring others to light. The old red barn, which had stood for over a century keeping its secrets, would now stand for centuries more, not just as a working farm building, but as a monument to those who had risked everything for freedom and union in a divided nation. And all because an old tractor had broken through a flaw that had kept its secrets for over 150 years, revealing not just a fortune in gold, but a priceless legacy of courage, sacrifice, and hope. The weekend brought Emma home from university, her compact car kicking up dust as it sped down the long driveway to Oakridge Farm. Jackson watched from the porch as his daughter parked next to the government vehicles and historical society vans that had transformed his normally quiet farmyard into something resembling an archaeological expedition base. For 3 days now, experts had been documenting, photographing, and carefully exploring the tunnel network beneath the barn, each new discovery adding layers to the extraordinary story hidden beneath his land for over a century and a half. Emma emerged from her car, her expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief as she took in the scene. The yellow tape cordoning off the barn, the makeshift workstation set up under canopies, the steady stream of people in various official capacities, moving purposefully between buildings. She spotted her father and jogged toward him, her university backpack bouncing against her shoulder. "Dad!" she called as she approached. "This is unbelievable! I've been reading everything Dr. Reynolds sent me about underground railroad operations in Nebraska territory. But seeing all this," she gestured at the activity surrounding them, "it makes it real in a way the research papers couldn't." Jackson embraced his daughter, surprised at how her presence immediately lightened the weight of responsibility he'd been carrying since the discovery. "It's been quite a week," he acknowledged. "Every day they find something new down there. Yesterday they discovered a hidden room with forged identification papers and plantation escape maps dating back to 1862. Emma's eyes widened. "Can I see the tunnel? The actual site?" "Dr. Reynolds has been asking when you'd arrive. He's eager to show you everything they've found." Jackson led her toward the barn, where proper scaffolding now supported the floor around the opening, and temporary lighting had been installed throughout the tunnel network. "They've made it much safer than when I first fell in, and the tractor's been secured so it won't collapse further." As they approached, Dr. Reynolds emerged from the barn, his face lighting up when he spotted Emma. "Ms. Miller, perfect timing. We've just uncovered what appears to be a communication station, a setup for sending and receiving coded messages between underground railroad conductors. And the journal mentions your father showed you. It references a cipher key we believe is hidden somewhere in the farmhouse itself." Emma's academic background immediately engaged with the historical puzzle. The farmhouse wasn't built until 1885, though. That's 20 years after the end of the Civil War. Dr. Reynolds nodded, approvingly at her quick analysis. Exactly, which suggests the cipher key was deliberately incorporated into the house's construction, hidden in plain sight, perhaps as architectural features or design elements that would only be recognizable to those who knew what to look for. The window frames, Jackson said suddenly, remembering something that had always seemed odd. In the front parlor, they have these unusual carved patterns that don't match the rest of the house's style. My grandfather always refused to replace them, even when we renovated other parts of the house. Dr. Reynolds' eyes lit up. That could be it. During the Civil War era, certain woodworking patterns were used by underground railroad stations to communicate information. The number of safe rooms, direction of the next station, warnings about patrols. If these carvings were preserved through successive renovations, they're still there, Jackson confirmed, unchanged since the house was built. Within minutes, the three of them were examining the ornate window frames in the farmhouses. Formal parlor, a room Jackson rarely used but had maintained out of respect for family tradition. The carvings were subtle, geometric patterns and stylized oak leaves that to an untrained eye would appear merely decorative. But under Dr. Reynolds's knowledgeable inspection, they revealed themselves as much more. This is extraordinary, the historian breathed, photographing each element with careful precision. These aren't just random decorative elements, they're a communications system. This repeated pattern of 8 notches followed by 3 longer grooves, that's a directional indicator pointing north. And these interlocking circles, they typically represented safe houses within a day's journey. Emma examined the carvings closely. So the house was built by someone connected to the Underground Railroad network, even 20 years after the war ended. That's what makes this so historically significant, Dr. Reynolds explained, his excitement evident. Most historical accounts suggest that Underground Railroad operations dissolved after emancipation. But this, along with the tunnels and journal, suggests that at least some of the network infrastructure remained active well into the Reconstruction era and beyond. Jackson's mind was racing, connecting fragments of family stories with this new information. My grandfather used to tell me that this land was chosen with purpose by the man who built the house. I always thought he meant it was good farmland, but what if it meant something more? Before Dr. Reynolds could respond, Agent Cooper appeared in the doorway. "We've completed the initial inventory of the gold cache," she announced. "There are 316 $10 gold eagles and 189 $20 double eagles, all dating between 1861 and 1865. At current market value for historical gold coins of this provenance, the collection is worth approximately $3 million, and that's a conservative estimate given the unique historical context." The number hung in the air, its magnitude momentarily silencing everyone in the room. $3 million. It was more money than Jackson had ever imagined possessing, enough to pay off the farm's debt several times over, enough to secure the property's future for generations to come. "There's more," Agent Cooper continued. "We've found what appears to be military correspondence, suggesting this wasn't just a rogue operation. There are coded orders signed by individuals we believe were working directly under the authority of the Secretary of War. If authenticated, these documents would confirm that Thornton Station was an officially sanctioned Union intelligence outpost, operating under the cover of Underground Railroad activities." Dr. Reynolds looked as though he might float off the floor with excitement. This would fundamentally alter our understanding of Western territorial operations during the Civil War. The historical consensus has always been that organized Union intelligence activities barely extended beyond the Mississippi. But if there was a sanctioned network this far west, it would explain the gold, Emma said thoughtfully. That amount would fund significant operations, not just helping escaped slaves move north, but gathering intelligence, supporting Union sympathizers, perhaps even countering Confederate guerrilla activities in the territories. As the implications of these discoveries continued to unfold, Walter Davidson arrived, accompanied by Tom Fletcher. The elderly man moved slowly, but with determination, carrying an ancient leather portfolio that he clutched protectively against his chest. "I've brought something you need to see," he announced without preamble. "Found it in my attic last night after our talk. My grandfather kept it against all orders to destroy operational documents after the war ended. Said someday the truth would need to be told." With trembling hands, Walter placed the portfolio on the parlor table and carefully opened it. Inside were yellow documents, hand-drawn maps, and a small leather-bound codebook with the embossed insignia of the Union Army's Department of Military Information, a division so secret that most historical accounts barely acknowledged its existence. "This is the Regional Operations Manual for what they called the Liberty Line," Walter explained, his voice strengthening as he connected with his own family's hidden history. Not just an escape route for slaves, but a full military intelligence network operating throughout the Western Territories. "My grandfather was a junior coordinator, responsible for maintaining communications between stations like Thornton's and Military Command in St. Louis." The documents confirmed everything they had been piecing together and added crucial context. The maps showed a network of stations extending from eastern Nebraska northward into Dakota Territory and westward toward Wyoming and Colorado, a sophisticated intelligence infrastructure operating behind what many assumed was simply humanitarian assistance for escaped slaves. "According to my grandfather," Walter continued, "the network served multiple purposes simultaneously. Yes, they helped hundreds of escaped slaves reach freedom, but they also gathered intelligence on Confederate sympathizer activities in the territories, moved Union funds and supplies along secure routes, and maintained communication channels that operated outside standard military frameworks that might be compromised. Dr. Reynolds was handling the documents with reverent care, his trained historian's eye recognizing their immense significance. "This is unprecedented," he kept saying. "Historical accounts have acknowledged that individual Underground Railroad conductors sometimes provided intelligence to Union forces. But evidence of a formal, integrated intelligence network using the Underground Railroad as operational cover, it fundamentally reshapes our understanding of Civil War operations in the Western Territories." As they examined the documents, a name on one of the maps caught Jackson's attention. Davidson Station, it read, marked about 15 miles northeast of Thornton Station. He looked up at Walter. "Your family wasn't just documenting this network. They were part of it." Walter nodded, a mixture of pride and long-held secrecy evident in his expression. "My grandfather's farm was another station on the Liberty Line. Smaller than Thornton's operation, we didn't have the extensive tunnels or gold repository, but we provided safe haven and communication relay services. After the war, when the network was supposedly disbanded, some of us maintained contact, keeping the old connections alive through family relationships and business partnerships. Which is why your grandfather knew about this place," Jackson realized, "and possibly why my grandfather bought this specific property during the Depression." Walter's expression confirmed Jackson's suspicion. There were those who remembered the network, who understood its significance even decades later. When farms went up for sale during the Depression, certain properties were guided toward purchasers who would respect their history, even if they didn't know all the details. 8. The interconnection of their families across generations added yet another layer to the unfolding story. What had begun as an accidental discovery was revealing itself as part of a carefully maintained historical continuity. Knowledge preserved and protected, passed down through subtle means when direct communication was too risky. Agent Cooper, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing interest, interjected a practical question. "Mr. Davidson, these documents, are you aware they may still be classified under historical security protocols? Materials related to Civil War intelligence operations weren't fully declassified in many cases." Walter fixed the government agent with a steady gaze that belied his frail appearance. "Young lady, these documents are 160 years old. The operations they describe have been over for a century and a half. If your government still considers them secret, then it's well past time for that to change." Rather than bristle at the challenge, Agent Cooper smiled unexpectedly. "I completely agree, Mr. Davidson. In fact, I've already initiated an expedited declassification review through my department. Historical truth serves the national interest far better than perpetual secrecy in cases like this." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a renowned expert on African American history who had driven in from Chicago overnight at Dr. Reynolds' urgent request. She swept into the parlor with the focused energy of someone accustomed to evaluating historical discoveries, her keen eyes immediately taking in the assembled documents. "Martin sent me the preliminary photographs," she said, addressing the room, but moving directly to the table where the journal and Walter's documents were displayed. "If authenticated, this represents one of the most significant Underground Railroad discoveries in the past 50 years, particularly given the western location and military connection." After examining the materials for several minutes in focused silence, she looked up at Jackson. "Mr. Miller, you've inadvertently uncovered a historical treasure of immense significance. The Underground Railroad's western operations have been tragically underdocumented, creating a historical gap in our understanding of both Black freedom movements and Civil War military operations beyond the Mississippi." She turned to Walter. "Davidson, and these operational documents, they're extraordinary. They demonstrate a level of organizational sophistication that directly contradicts the common historical narrative of Western Underground Railroad operations as loosely connected or improvisational." Dr. Reynolds nodded eagerly. "That's precisely what makes this site so exceptional. It wasn't just an isolated station operated by a sympathetic individual. It was part of a coordinated network with official, albeit covert, military sanction." Dr. Whitman's expression grew thoughtful. "There's a deeper significance here as well. These documents show Black Americans not just as passive recipients of assistance, but as active intelligence operatives, contributing critical information, serving as couriers, and helping to maintain the integrity of the network. The journal entries about individuals codenamed Witness and Navigator clearly describe formerly enslaved people who had become essential operational assets." As the historians continued their analysis, Agent Cooper drew Jackson aside. "Mr. Miller, we need to discuss security arrangements. Once news of this discovery becomes public, and it will, given its historical significance, your property will attract considerable attention. We should implement protection protocols for both the physical site and the artifacts." Jackson hadn't considered this aspect of the discovery. "You think there's a risk?" "Not of danger," she clarified, "but of overwhelming interest. Historical discoveries of this magnitude attract media, researchers, enthusiasts, and unfortunately, occasionally, relic hunters. The gold alone would warrant security measures, but the historical artifacts are arguably even more valuable from a national heritage perspective." This conversation was interrupted by Emma, who'd been studying the maps with intense focus. "Dad, Agent Cooper, I think I've found something important. Look at these markings along what seems to be the supply routes." She pointed to a series of symbols repeated at various points on the territorial map. They match the carvings on our window frames exactly, and if I'm interpreting this correctly, they indicate additional storage locations, possible secondary gold repositories at other stations. Dr. Reynolds joined them, examining Emma's discovery with growing excitement. She's right. These are cache indicators, showing secure storage locations throughout the network. And based on this key in the code book, he flipped to a page Walter had indicated, they specifically designate resource repositories for sustained operations. Some of these locations would now be under lakes created by damming projects in the 1930s, but others would still be accessible. Agent Cooper finished, her professional interest clearly piqued. Mr. Miller, Ms. Miller, this discovery may extend well beyond your property. If these other repositories exist and contain similar materials, then we've only found one piece of a much larger historical puzzle, Emma said, the academic researcher in her fully engaged. The day continued with more experts arriving, more documents being analyzed, and more sections of the tunnel network being carefully documented. Jackson found himself alternating between active participation in the discoveries and moments of quiet observation, watching as his struggling farm, the source of so much worry for so long, transformed into the epicenter of historical revelation. By evening, when most of the researchers had departed for their hotels in Lincoln with promises to return at dawn, Jackson sat with Emma on the porch swing that had hung from the same hooks for 3 generations. The spring air had turned cool, and they shared a blanket as they had when Emma was small, and they would watch summer thunderstorms roll across the prairie. It's a lot to process, Emma said after a comfortable silence. When you called about the tractor breaking through the floor, I thought maybe you'd found an old storage cellar, or at most, some Prohibition-era hiding spot. Not all this. Jackson nodded, watching the last light fade from the sky. I keep thinking about Grandpa Harold. All those years he insisted this land was special, that it was chosen for a reason. I always thought it was just farmers' pride talking. Maybe he knew something, Emma suggested. Not everything, probably, but something. Those carvings in the parlor, you said he absolutely refused to change them, right? Wouldn't even let your grandmother paint over them when she redecorated in the 70s, Jackson confirmed. Said they were part of the house's character. I never thought much about it. Just one of his quirks. Emma pulled the blanket tighter as the night air cooled further. I've been thinking about what Walter said, about certain properties being guided toward purchasers who would respect their history. What if Grandpa was part of that? What if someone steered him toward this? Farm specifically because they knew he would be the right kind of caretaker? The possibility resonated with fragments of memory. His grandfather's occasional cryptic references to obligations beyond the obvious. His insistence that certain aspects of the property remain undisturbed, the locked box found after his death, containing what Jackson had always assumed were sentimental trinkets, but now might represent something more significant. If that's true, Jackson said slowly, then in some way I've been preparing for this discovery my whole life without knowing it. Every time Grandpa taught me to respect the land, to understand its quirks and character, to preserve rather than replace the original features of the farm. He was preparing me to be the next caretaker. Emma smiled, resting her head on her father's shoulder, as she had done as a child. And you raised me the same way. 3 generations of Millers, all unknowingly preserving something much bigger than a family farm. The thought brought unexpected comfort, transforming Jackson's fear of being the miller who failed into the possibility of being the miller who fulfilled the farm's deeper purpose. The weight of potential foreclosure and financial ruin that had haunted him for years seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of being part of something meaningful that extended far beyond his immediate concerns. The next morning brought new developments. As the research team expanded their explorations, a secondary tunnel was discovered extending toward the creek, emerging in a carefully concealed opening in the creek bank that would have provided an emergency escape route for those hiding in the underground network. Within this newly discovered passage, they found additional historical materials, medical supplies dating to the 1860s, a collection of forged identification papers and travel documents, and most significantly, a hidden compartment containing personal items belonging to those who had passed through the station. "These are precious beyond measure," Dr. Whitman said, her voice hushed with respect as she carefully catalogued small keepsakes, handwritten prayers, and tiny mementos that represented the last tangible connections many freedom seekers had to family members left behind. Most underground railroad sites yield structural evidence or operational documents, but personal artifacts of those who pass through, these are extraordinarily rare. Among these items was a carefully wrapped bundle containing a child's rag doll, a hand-carved wooden medallion with West African symbols, and a small leather pouch holding what appeared to be seeds. Accompanying these items was a note written in a careful hand, entrusted to Conductor Thornton by Sarah, aged 26, continuing north with infant daughter. To be reclaimed when safe passage to Canada is confirmed. April 1864. She never returned for them, Dr. Whitman said softly. The historical record may never tell us if Sarah and her daughter reached Canada safely or if their journey was interrupted. But these items she valued enough to preserve. They're now part of our national story, evidence of courage and hope in the face of unimaginable adversity. The personal dimension of the discovery affected everyone involved. What had begun as an exciting historical find and potential financial salvation for the farm deepened into something more profound, a connection to individual lives and sacrifices that had transpired beneath this land generations ago. The gold and military documents remained significant, but these humble personal items brought an emotional resonance that transcended academic interest. As the day progressed, the preliminary assessment team from the National Park Service arrived to evaluate the site's potential inclusion in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, a designation that would provide both recognition and preservation resources. Led by Regional Director Marcus Johnson, the team brought specialized expertise in historical conservation and public interpretation of sensitive historical sites. "What we're seeing here is unique in several respects," Director Johnson explained, as he toured the tunnels and examined the documentation. Most authenticated underground railroad sites are east of the Mississippi, with only a handful of documented stations in the Western Territories. And the military intelligence connection adds a dimension that's rarely seen in such well-preserved form. He turned to Jackson, his expression serious but encouraging. "Mr. Miller, your property appears to meet and exceed our criteria for inclusion in the network to freedom. More than that, it may warrant consideration as a national historic landmark, given its exceptional significance in illustrating our nation's heritage." The implications of such designation were substantial. Not just recognition and prestige, but practical support in the form of preservation grants, technical assistance, and educational resources. For a farm that had been on the verge of foreclosure, just days earlier, the transformation in prospects was almost dizzying. "What would this mean for the working farm?" Jackson asked, his practical farmer's mindset asserting itself amid the historical excitement. "This land has been in agricultural production for generations. I wouldn't want to see it become just a museum piece." Director Johnson nodded approvingly. "The best historical sites maintain their living connection to the land. We would work with you to develop a management plan that preserves both the historical elements and the agricultural tradition. In fact, The continuing farm operation would be an asset to interpretation, helping visitors understand how the Underground Railroad operated within the context of normal agricultural activities as cover. This balanced approach resonated with Jackson's own instincts. The thought of Oakridge Farm continuing as a working agricultural operation while also sharing its remarkable historical significance felt right, honoring both his family's farming legacy and the previously hidden history they had unknowingly preserved. As the day's activities wound down, Agent Cooper approached Jackson with news about the legal status of the discovery. Treasury Department legal counsel has completed the preliminary ownership assessment, she informed him. While the gold, technically, remains government property as it was never decommissioned from military service, your position as the discovering landowner entitles you to the maximum statutory finder's reward, 40% of assessed value. She handed him an official-looking document. This confirms the provisional reward determination pending final authentication and valuation. Based on current estimates, your portion would be approximately $2 million, tax-advantaged under historical preservation statutes. Jackson stared at the document, the figure seeming almost abstract in its magnitude. Just days ago, he had been calculating how to stretch his remaining funds to cover essential seed purchases for spring planting. Now, he was holding paperwork allocating more money than his farm had generated in the past 20 years combined. There's an additional consideration, Agent Cooper continued. Given the exceptional historical significance of this site, several philanthropic foundations specializing in historical preservation have expressed interest in providing matching grants for restoration and educational development. Dr. Reynolds is coordinating those inquiries, but preliminary indications suggest substantial additional funding may be available. The financial transformation of Oakridge Farm's prospects was only one aspect of the changes unfolding. By late afternoon, Emma had established an impromptu historical documentation center in the dining room, coordinating the various research threads and beginning to compile what she described as the first draft of a significantly revised historical narrative of Western territorial operations during the Civil War. Her academic training had found perfect application in this unexpected context, and Jackson observed with paternal pride how confidently she engaged with renowned historians and government specialists, her analytical mind quickly grasping connections and implications that others sometimes missed. What had been theoretical academic interest in agricultural history had transformed into passionate engagement with a living historical discovery in which she was now playing a key role. Dr. Whitman thinks I should consider changing my thesis. A focus, Emma told her father during a brief break. She's offered to co-advise if I want to pursue graduate work on Underground Railroad operations in Western agricultural communities. Says there's an entire field of study opening up based on what we've found here. Jackson smiled, recognizing that the discovery was transforming his daughter's future as profoundly as it was changing the farm's prospects. Your grandfather always said this land would provide for the family in unexpected ways. I don't think even he could have imagined this particular turn of events. As sunset approached, bringing a close to the day's explorations and documentation, Jackson found a quiet moment to visit the barn alone. The structure that had worried him for so long with its deteriorating condition now stood at the center of intense interest and promised preservation. The hole in the floor that had initially seemed like one more burden to bear had become a portal to both historical understanding and financial salvation. Standing beside his grandfather's old tractor, still partially suspended over the opening it had created, Jackson felt a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude for the unexpected turn of events, wonder at the history that had lain hidden beneath his feet for decades, and a deepening sense of connection to the land that went far beyond. Agricultural productivity. "Land abides," he murmured, echoing his grandfather's favorite saying. But now the phrase carried new meaning. This land had not just endured as productive acreage, it had preserved crucial historical truths, protecting them until the moment was right for their revelation. And the Miller family, through 3 generations, had been its unwitting guardians, maintaining, protecting, and preserving something far more significant than they had ever realized. As Jackson turned to leave the barn, he noticed something he had overlooked in the excitement of recent days. A small carving on one of the original support posts, almost worn away by time, but still faintly visible in the fading light. It was the same interlocking circle pattern found on the parlor window frames and the Liberty Line maps, accompanied by a simple phrase etched in careful lettering: "Until the truth abides in light." The message from the past seemed to speak directly to the present moment, as if Samuel Thornton and all those who had worked in secret beneath this land had somehow known that one day their story would emerge from darkness, their courage finally recognized, their sacrifices honored. And Jackson Miller, struggling Nebraska farmer turned accidental historical custodian, found himself humbled to be the one who had finally fulfilled that long-delayed promise. 6 months after the discovery that changed everything, Jackson Miller stood on the newly constructed observation platform overlooking his cornfields, watching a very different kind of activity than the struggling farm had seen in decades. Where once he had worried alone about drought and bank payments, now dozens of visitors moved along carefully designed pathways between the restored Red Barn and the modern exhibition center that housed artifacts from what newspapers had dubbed America's hidden heartland history. The morning sun caught the gleam of the commemorative plaque near the barn entrance. From this site between 1863–1865, over 200 freedom seekers were guided northward to liberty, while Union intelligence operations helped secure the Western Territories. The full story, hidden for generations, stands as testament to ordinary Americans performing extraordinary acts of courage during our nation's greatest trial. Jackson checked his watch. The Secretary of the Interior would be arriving within. The hour for the official dedication ceremony of the Oakridge Underground Railroad and Liberty Line National Historic Site. In the month since his grandfather's tractor had broken through the barn floor, revealing the tunnel network and its extraordinary contents, Jackson's life had transformed as completely as the property itself. The financial aspects alone had been life-changing. The Treasury Department's final valuation of the gold cache had resulted in a finder's reward of just over $1. $6 million for Jackson, more than enough to clear all farm debts and establish an endowment for ongoing operations. But the greater value had come from the site's historical significance, bringing preservation grants, educational funding, and tourism revenue that had transformed Oakridge from a struggling family farm into a sustainable enterprise combining agricultural production with historical education. "Getting nervous about your speech?" Emma asked, joining her father on the platform. She had taken a semester's leave from university to help establish the site's research center, which now employed 3 full-time historians documenting the Liberty Line network across 5 states. Jackson smiled at his daughter, noting how the past months had changed her too, giving her confidence and purpose beyond anything her academic studies had previously inspired. "Just trying to take it all in," he replied. "Sometimes I still expect to wake up and find it was all just some elaborate dream, that I'm still staring at foreclosure notices and wondering how to make it through another season." Emma linked her arm through his. "Instead, you're hosting cabinet secretaries and being interviewed for national magazines. Not bad for a man who just wanted to move his tractor out of the rain." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Reynolds, who approached with barely contained excitement. "The final authentication results just came in from the Smithsonian," he announced, waving a document. "The journal is officially confirmed as the most complete first-hand account of Western Underground Railroad operations ever discovered. They're calling it the single most significant advancement in Civil War-era historical documentation of the past 50 years. This was merely the latest in a steady stream of validations that had rolled in since the discovery. What had begun as an accidental finding had burgeoned into a historical revelation that was literally rewriting textbooks. The tunnel network beneath Oakridge Farm had proven to be just the first piece of a much larger historical puzzle, as researchers following the clues in Samuel Thornton's journal and Walter Davidson's family documents had identified at least 8 other Liberty Line stations across Nebraska and neighboring states. 3 of these sites had yielded additional documentation, though none as extensive as Oakridge. Together, they painted a picture of sophisticated covert operations extending throughout the Western Territories, a network more extensive and more officially connected to Union military intelligence than historians had previously recognized. Tom Fletcher approached, accompanied by Walter Davidson, who at 94 remained remarkably engaged with the historical research his family documents had helped spark. "They've found another one," Tom announced, "a site in western Iowa that matches the coordinates in Walter's grandfather's papers. Initial excavation has uncovered a tunnel entrance almost identical to ours." Walter nodded, his aged face animated by vindication. "Told you there were more. The Liberty Line wasn't just a few isolated stations, it was a comprehensive network. My grandfather said it stretched from Missouri to Canada with dozens of active stations even after the war officially ended. This expanding revelation had transformed not just Oakridge Farm, but the entire region's understanding of its Civil War history. Communities that had long believed themselves peripheral to the great national struggle were discovering their lands had hosted crucial operations that helped determine the conflict's outcome. Local historical societies from Nebraska to Dakota Territory were re-examining family records and architectural oddities with new awareness of potential connections to the Liberty Line network. For Jackson, the most meaningful aspect had been the discovery of his own family's intentional connection to this history. Among Harold Miller's personal effects, preserved by Jackson's father and passed down after his death, they had found a small leather pouch containing a brass token identical to those documented in the Liberty Line operational materials, a 5-pointed star with a central eye design. Further research revealed that Harold Miller's own father had been part of a network of Civil War veterans who had quietly maintained knowledge of historically significant sites, arranging for their purchase by trustworthy individuals when original ownership families died out or faced financial hardship. Harold's acquisition of the foreclosed Oakridge property in 1937 had not been the random choice of a desperate farmer seeking a fresh start, but a deliberate act of historical stewardship, one he had never explicitly explained to his family, but had prepared them for through subtle guidance and restrictions about certain aspects of the property. "Your father's here," Emma said, nudging Jackson and pointing toward the parking area where a familiar pickup truck had just arrived. William Miller, 82 years old and still straight-backed despite his years, made his way slowly but steadily toward them. He had been visiting his brother in Arizona when Jackson's tractor broke through the barn floor and had returned to find his son's struggling farm transformed into a nationally recognized historic site. His pride in this unexpected development was evident in every tour he gave visitors, proudly recounting his father Harold's connection to the property and his insistence on preserving certain features that now revealed their historical significance. "Place looks good," William observed, as he joined them on the platform, surveying the renovated barn and the carefully preserved original farmhouse that now served as administrative offices for the historic site. Dad would have approved. He knew, didn't he? Jackson asked quietly, a question he had posed several times since the discovery. Maybe not everything, but he knew this land was special beyond just being good for farming. William nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. He never said it outright, but there were hints, the way he forbade certain changes to the property, how he'd sometimes stand in that barn for hours, just looking at the floor, like he was seeing something none of the rest of us could see. The locked box he kept with that odd token and those papers written in that fancy old-style handwriting. Jackson had come to believe that his grandfather had been entrusted with general knowledge about the property's historical significance, if not the specific details of the tunnel network and its contents. Harold Miller had fulfilled his part of an intergenerational trust, preserving the site until the moment was right for its secrets to be revealed. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of the official delegation for the dedication ceremony. 3 black SUVs and a small motorcade proceeded up the farm's driveway, now widened and improved to accommodate the steady stream of visitors the site attracted. The Secretary of the Interior emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by the Governor of Nebraska, representatives from the Smithsonian Institution, and several distinguished historians who had been involved in authenticating and contextualizing the Oakridge discoveries. Jackson straightened his tie, an unaccustomed formality for a man who had spent his life in work clothes, and prepared to greet the dignitaries. Emma gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before moving to her position as coordinator for the day's events. William and Walter took their seats in the front row of chairs arranged before the podium, places of honor for their connections to the history being celebrated. The ceremony proceeded with speeches highlighting the historical significance of the Oakridge discovery, the secretary eloquently describing how the site fills a crucial gap in our national understanding of how the struggle for union and liberty manifested in the Western Territories. The governor spoke of pride in Nebraska's previously unrecognized role in the Underground Railroad and Union intelligence operations. Dr. Reynolds outlined the ongoing research spawned by the initial discovery, now extending across 5 states, and revealing a comprehensive network of covert operations. When Jackson's turn at the podium came, he spoke not of historical significance or national heritage, but of family legacy and stewardship of the land. My grandfather, Harold Miller, taught me that land abides, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. He meant that good land outlasts momentary hardships, drought years, market downturns, personal setbacks. But I've come to understand he meant something deeper as well. This land was abiding in both senses of the word, enduring through time, while also keeping faith with a promise made generations ago. He gestured toward the renovated barn and the tunnel entrance now preserved beneath a protective structure. For over 150 years, this ordinary-looking farm kept extraordinary secrets, waiting for the right moment to reveal a chapter of history that might otherwise have been lost forever. My family worked this land for 3 generations without fully understanding what we were preserving, but something in us recognized it was special, worth protecting, worth passing down, worth fighting to keep even when economic forces pushed towards selling or subdividing. Jackson looked toward his father and daughter, the past and future of the Miller connection to this land. Today, as Oakridge Farm begins its new chapter as both a working agricultural operation and a nationally recognized historic site, we honor not just Samuel Thornton and those who created the Liberty Line network, but all those whose sacrifices and courage made its operation necessary, and all those who preserved its memory when direct acknowledgement was impossible. The ceremony concluded with the official unveiling of the National Historic Landmark plaque and the ribbon cutting for the exhibition center. As visitors dispersed to tour the various features of the site, Jackson found a quiet moment alone in the barn where it had all begun. His grandfather's old John Deere tractor had been carefully preserved in its partially fallen position, now protected by a viewing platform and interpretive signage explaining its role in the discovery. Standing beside this humble farm implement that had inadvertently changed so much, Jackson reflected on how completely his life had transformed in just 6 months. The financial salvation of the farm, though welcome, seemed almost secondary to the deeper meaning the discovery had revealed, the connection between his family's agricultural stewardship and a pivotal chapter of American history, a connection that had been maintained through generations without being fully articulated or understood. Emma found him there, clipboard in hand, as she checked off items from the day's busy schedule. "The secretary wants to speak with you privately before he leaves," she informed him. "And Dr. Whitman has a proposal about expanding the educational programs to include more focus on the role of black operators within the Liberty Line network." Jackson nodded, prepared to return to the day's responsibilities, but took a moment longer to look at the tractor. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "all those years I worried about being the miller who failed, the one who couldn't keep the farm going, who lost what Grandpa Harold and Dad had built. I never imagined I might instead be the miller who fulfilled its deeper purpose." Emma smiled, understanding. "Maybe that's why the discovery happened during your time. Grandpa Harold preserved the site, Dad maintained it, but you were the one ready to see it become something more, to share its story, rather than just protect its secrets." Together, they walked back toward the sunlight streaming through the barn door, leaving behind the old tractor that had broken through more than just weathered floorboards. It had broken through the veil separating personal struggle from historical significance, revealing how an ordinary family farm in Nebraska had been part of an extraordinary chapter in American history. Outside, visitors moved between the exhibition center and the preserved tunnels. Families read interpretive signs explaining the Liberty Line network, and researchers continued documenting newly discovered artifacts. The old red barn stood watch. Over it all, its worn timbers containing both the history it had witnessed and the future it would help create. A future where courage, long hidden, would finally receive its recognition, and where a struggling farmer's accidental discovery had changed not just his own fortunes, but our collective understanding of a pivotal chapter in the American story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.